Hi, and welcome to this segment that is the seventh in a series that's covering different topics on grief and bereavement. My name is Cindy Rowe, and I'm an MSW student at Marywood University, and this presentation will focus on aspects of suicide. Some recent statistical data from the United States indicates that, on average, 30,000 people commit suicide each year. Overall, this ranks 11th in causes of death, and suicide especially affects those in the 15 to 24-year-old age group, as it is the third cause of death for this cohort. Additionally, as we'll see a little later, suicide is also more prevalent among people in particular fields, claiming countless lives of soldiers, veterans, and police officers each year. While more attempts at suicide are made by women, men are more likely to complete their attempts. One thing forensic investigators do in cases of suicide is to try to learn about the person who died and the circumstances surrounding their death. By studying their personality and lifestyle and the chain of events leading up to their death, investigators hope to clarify the cause of the person's death and to determine why it occurred when it did, as this information is helpful in predicting future suicide attempts by other people, and it also helps the surviving family members and friends work through their grief. Because suicide notes are like a record that can give important insight into the mental and emotional state of the deceased, they are a key piece of forensic evidence. Only about 25% of suicide victims, however, ever leave a note or any type of last communication. Sometimes suicide notes explain the reasons behind the person's decision to commit suicide, and they may stress that no surviving person is really to blame for this situation. Other times, though, suicide notes express varying degrees of anger and blame. So suicide notes are usually vitally important to surviving family members because they see them as the last words of their loved one and their attempts at finalizing their personal affairs. Thus, changes in protocol have been made where suicide notes are now returned to the next of kin once the death investigation is complete. Research into suicide deaths have identified some different types of suicide based on the presumed motivations of the victim. First, some people may commit suicide as a way of escaping from intense pain or anguish. One point of view regarding death with dignity practices is that the dying person exercises their right to autonomy by electing when to end their pain and suffering. So that's an example of escape. Emotional anguish that builds from a person's idea of self, sometimes in combination with a difficulty in relating to other people, can cause somebody to perceive themselves as a failure or not measuring up to expected standards in some way. So this crisis of identity can become so overwhelming that the anguish from that drives them to suicide. This can help explain why certain populations, such as college students who are in highly competitive majors and schools, and people in the military or those who work as police officers, that can help explain why there's higher instances of suicide in those populations. As a cry for help, suicide is seen as a way of fixing a problem. It's a message that says basically something has to change. Suicide ideation and attempts are often the cries for help and are often seen in adolescence, along with other self-harming behaviors such as cutting. This cry for help may be a way for them to express their frustration and anger and their degree of unhappiness. So it's vital for social workers and clinicians to acknowledge and validate the person's feelings and to take the necessary steps to prevent them from harming themselves and help them work toward improving and increasing their ability to communicate with others and empowering them to work through their feelings. While some data indicate that there are roughly 25 attempts of suicide for every completion, it's vital that these cries for help not be taken lightly. I can't stress that enough. In subintentional death, the person covertly or subconsciously wants to end their life, so they engage in highly risky behaviors that lead to a quick death. As noted in the Dispelder and Strickland text, for example, evidence gathered from some accidents and homicides indicate that the deceased person actually played a role in their demise. For example, some people who aggressively engage police officers do that with the intent of being shot. In fact, on the local level, there was a recent police shooting over in Dutchess County in New York earlier in June of this year, and which fits this exact profile. Conversely, chronic suicide refers to those who slowly kill themselves through such things as using alcohol, drugs, or smoking. Lastly, a person in intense crisis as a result of major life changes are also at increased risk for suicide. Other risk factors for suicide include being a member of a highly stigmatized group. Those within the LGBT community, for example, they often experience various forms of harassment, abuse, and violence, in addition to a high degree of social ostracization and family estrangement. A person's personality can also be a risk for suicide, as those with a more pessimistic outlook on life might harbor greater fear and anxiety, which can inhibit their ability to interact with others, thereby limiting their circle of social support. And as discussed earlier, stressful life events can increase the risk of suicide for some people. Specifically, grieving the death of a significant person in one's life, particularly if that loss was a traumatic one, has been linked to increased risk of suicide. Peer influence can also play a major role. For teens, problems with relationships with their peers and family, these are often cited as the reason for teens' suicide ideation and attempts. While for young adults, stressors such as academic stress and achievement, issues in their committed relationships, and career stress and dissatisfaction are common antecedents. Because career and marriage problems can carry over into middle adulthood, suicides in this era of life tend to be associated with those causes more often than not. As mentioned earlier, the very nature of certain types of work, again, such as police officers and soldiers, unfortunately, these careers carry with them a higher instance of suicide. And in late adulthood, multiple losses, such as the death of one's spouse, which is particularly troublesome for men, social isolation, depression, and feelings of being useless, the loss of life's purpose and meaning, and incapacitation or deteriorating health. These are all implicated as risk factors for suicide in this age group. A variety of preventive options to reduce suicide include crisis hotlines. Although they offer short-term help to those contemplating suicide, crisis center workers are trained to help de-escalate the situation and calm the person so they can take the next steps they need to address their problems. Education and community outreach are also preventative efforts that can help normalize the feelings of disappointment and frustration a person who may be considering suicide is likely feeling, and stressing that the complexity of life means that everybody at some point in their life will have situations come up that are stressful. Such outreach initiatives typically also include support group resources that are designated to meet the specific needs of the community where they're based, as well as the needs of specific populations, like we just talked about, such as veterans, the LGBT community, Native Americans, and immigrants, for example. Lastly, putting up physical barriers in places where suicides have occurred in the past, like the fencing around the walkways of bridges. These are other preventative measures against suicide. Some key points to helping those who are in crisis and contemplating suicide are, first and foremost, do something. Don't be afraid to get involved and to help. Take all threats and ideations of suicide seriously, and be mindful for clues of escalation and increased intent. Offer the person compassion, understanding, and support as you talk to them. One de-escalation technique that a colleague of mine taught me is to use a calm, quieter voice when interacting with someone who is escalating and who is in crisis, as this can help them calm down. So, if they're talking in an increasingly agitated and higher pitched voice, temper your voice down so it's calmer and talking slower. So, and also don't be afraid of talking to them. Ask them questions. Just keep them talking and keep probing. Validate their perspective and their feelings, and do this until you can get in contact with professional help. And if you can, one thing you can do is put the crisis hotline on speakerphone as you're talking to the person in face-to-face. So you have yourself and the crisis person on the phone, so you can both work together to talk the person down. Also, offer the person other positive alternatives as you talk to them. For family members and friends who've lost a loved one to suicide, interventions include conducting a comprehensive assessment to identify their personal, spiritual, and social strengths and their needs in those areas. Early on after the loss, visiting the bereft at home was a practice that one suicide grief program engaged in, wherein the social worker was able to offer the family referrals for support programs and psychoeducational materials on a variety of helpful topics, including the grief process, helping them build up their social network and drawing from it, and providing those in their support network with information on how they can help. This as well as providing referral information for support groups, and again, for when they feel ready to join one. These are all other interventions to help suicide survivors. Additionally, helping these family members and friends identify grief triggers and to adequately prepare for them, along with helping them find ways to remember their loved one in a positive light. These are all other methods for facilitating their coping. So this includes this presentation, and if you're interested in learning more about the grief process, be sure to check out my YouTube channel, where you'll find other videos on other topics relating to grief and bereavement and its context of social work. Thanks again for watching.